so good to see all of you here. There should be a sign-in sheet going around. If you can't find your name on there, either because it's just not there by error or because you weren't here last week, please just skip to the last page. Give us your name and the email address you'd like us to contact you at. That's going to be really important, not just so I can build an impressive-looking collection of email addresses, but so I can send you stuff in the course of the week that can be useful to you while you read Romans. Like I said, I can't remember which table this was I was just talking to, but next week, Romans 2 is the second hardest chapter that we're going to talk about. And so I want to send you some stuff during the week that can give you just enough guidance that you feel like while you're reading Romans 2, you're not just up the creek without a paddle. Cool? All right.
What's the hardest?
7. Romans 7 is the hardest single chapter in all of Paul's letters. Okay. We're going to take a few minutes and just kind of get quiet before God, get ready to engage the Word. A couple verses to think about as we start. First, Ephesians 6:19, Paul says, "Pray also for me to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel." So, number 1, gospel is a mystery. Number 2, from Daniel chapter 2, "No wise man can show to the king the mystery that the king is asking, but there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries." So consider those two truths. 1, the gospel is a divine mystery. Number 2, wise people don't figure out divine mysteries on their own, but there is a God who reveals them. So, for the next 3 minutes or so, take about half the time, just close your eyes, center your attention on God, and this is what I'd encourage you to do. It's a little prayer technique called palms up, palms down. So start with your palms down and just offer to God all your wisdom, all your strength, all your energy, and confess that it's not enough. That when it comes to divine mysteries, what you have is not enough. Then when you're done surrendering to God what you have and what you don't have, turn your palms up and pray to God, asking Him to provide the insight that you need, because He's the God who reveals mysteries and you're trusting in Him today. And I will stop you in 3 minutes. God, we thank you that you're a God who wants your people to know you. And so you do give us wisdom and insight that doesn't just come from ourselves. Lord, we admit that we do want to know you, that we want to fathom the deep things of God, the mysteries of God, the stuff that was hidden for ages and ages, but that's now been revealed. So take this time today and be the revealer of mysteries. Open our minds, our hearts to receive the truth of your word. Help us to discern stuff that we never knew was there. Lord, feel free to challenge us and confront us with the direction, the correction, the encouragement that we all need. And help us to respond faithfully to your word. Lord, when your truth comes, help us to live and order our lives in a way that's pleasing to you. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Great to see all of you here today. We're going to do one more prayer thing real fast. Just as I was kind of like praying and preparing for this class today, I feel like maybe there are some folks here who are really struggling with a lack of joy in their Christian life. So if you just feel like you are trying to push through this Christianity thing and it is excruciating and it feels like the wilderness and there's just no strength, no support, no life in it, you only maybe even showed up today because you would have been embarrassed to pass me in the hallway if you hadn't. This is what we're going to do. If you're comfortable with that, I just want to encourage you to put your hands up, if that's you, and then we're going to have the folks around your table who are able just kind of stand around you. Some people put their hands on their shoulder and we'll pray for you. Elders in the room, if there's at least 3 or 4. If you see somebody with their hand up, just kind of walk and take the lead in prayer. So go ahead. If that's you and you'd like some folks just to pray with you this morning, let's take the opportunity. Couple elders coming to you. We'll pray for a minute and then we'll get underway. Yeah, everybody pray along. Christianity is a team sport. Lord God, we thank you that the Lord Jesus was himself anointed with the oil of joy above all of his companions. And you say that the joy of the Lord is our strength. We know that because Christ, the joyful one, is in us, that the joy of the Lord is also present. Lord, you say that the fruit of the Spirit includes joy, and so that's what I ask for my brother right now, that he would be filled with joy unspeakable and full of glory as he walks through his life, that his life of devotion to you, of faithfulness to you, in easy times and in hard, would be marked by joy that helps him to persevere, joy that is set and fixed and certain because it's joy in you and in your presence and in your nearness. Ask for these things today in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, guys. How many of you were here last week? Show of hands. How many of you were not here with us last week? Show of hands. Awesome. Okay. A couple minutes, just going to do a quick reset. The interest that all of you have shown in Romans is awesome, is so encouraging, but there's enough of you that means that me and the other facilitators just need to change a couple things. In principle, normally when I am teaching a Bible study, I like for all of us to sit around tables and talk about the text together, but once you get over a certain number of people in the same room, that just kind of stops working. Because you'll get one group of people that's done and another group of people that's going strong. And it's like trying to balance the bathwater in a tub if there were 40 taps into the tub. And it doesn't happen. So as a result, I am going to talk at you a bit more. I'm going to lecture more than I maybe normally would. And that means that I hope all of you feel free to ask questions. I'm using slides because slides are okay in a Bible study, but not in a sermon. And some of those slides say questions. So if while I'm talking, something comes to your mind and you're like, hang on, I missed that doesn't make sense, or it makes you think of another thing that you want to float past us, just jot those questions down. There's going to be time for questions today, some time for conversation. We're also looking into maybe using some more software to get questions in real time. So next week, if you bring... This is just the wrong thing to say during a Technopoly series. But if you bring a computer, if you bring a smartphone, you may be able to type in questions in real time for me and the other facilitators to see. That's something we're experimenting with. Cool? But at the end of the day, even though some things are changing, like going from Micah E to Micah D, the goal of our time together is still the same. I really want to help all of you read Romans, not just hear from me what you're supposed to hear from a pastor about Romans. So think about Romans again as climbing a mountain. We are all of us trying to get to the top. But in this like mountain climbing analogy, if Romans is Mount Everest, then you are Edmund Hillary and I am Tenzin Norgay. How many of you know who Tenzin Norgay was? Right? Like, I'm not going to be the famous one. I don't want to be the famous one at the end of this. I just happen to be the person who has lived for years around Romans and is familiar with the weather patterns and what it feels like to climb up and down part of this mountain. But success or failure here is going to mean you guys getting to the top, not me getting to the top and telling you what the view looks like. So lean into that. Like, I encourage you, make the most of it. Especially if you are a Christian who's been a Christian for a little while, and you know that Romans is supposed to be important to your Christian life, but every time you try and read it, you feel like you're missing something. Like, lean in over the next 8 or 9 weeks so that hopefully for however many decades God gives you in the rest of your Christian life, you don't feel defeated by Romans, but you can actually feel like it's a great resource for you. Okay? Quick recap. When we talked last week about all of Romans in 30 minutes or less, just the big picture outline. There's Romans 1 to 4 where Paul seems to talk a good bit about justification. There's Romans 5 to 8 where Paul talks a lot about like life in Christ and things like baptism and victory over sin. And then there's Romans 9 to 11 where he talks a ton about Israel. And then there's Romans 12 to 16 where he talks a lot about what it looks like to live as a Christian in community. And we tried to figure out which one of those might be sort of the center of gravity for Romans. We came away with these 3 big ideas that can really, really help you reading the book from left to right. First and foremost, we're going to touch on some of this again today, but Romans is Paul's letter introducing himself and his gospel message to people who don't already know him. And he knows that he's a controversial figure, so he knows before he shows up, he's got some explaining to do to prepare them to receive him so that they're not starting off kind of on their back foot like, oh shoot, this is Paul, we've been warned about him, right? So that's point 1. And sort of point 2, throughout the letter, Paul is going to be shadow boxing with these folks who misunderstand his gospel and say that on the basis of those misunderstandings that Paul's gospel is bad. Number 3, and again, I guess I just said this, but getting ready for his visit. This is a letter that he sends in advance. It's sort of like if you or I were going to go visit out-of-state relatives, we wouldn't just show up on their doorstep, right? Well, maybe you would, but I wouldn't. And we'd like to give some sort of call in advance. That's what Romans is. It's the call in advance of the visit. So the great thing about that is it means that in Romans, Paul has given us from left to right the clearest surviving picture of what he thinks the gospel is, that he has to preach. On the other hand, Paul doesn't think that in the book of Romans he has to say absolutely everything, because this is just the preparation. It's okay if there's some questions left in his mind, because he's going to show up later in person and clear it up. All Romans has to do is get him in the door. Like if you were applying for a job, this would be your cover letter. But then you'd actually show up and do the interview and fill in all the gaps that your cover letter left, right? So Romans tells us a lot, but if you find yourself bumping into questions along the way, Paul kind of expected that because it wasn't supposed to do everything, right? This isn't a 200-page book on the gospel. It's 16 chapters. So if you find yourself a little bit confused, some of that's just baked into the cake. It's not wrong with you. I want to move fast through the first 15 or so verses, but before I do, any questions? Yes, I see a hand, but not a face. Masha, there we are.
I have a question about the historic timeline.
Yes.
So it looks like in Romans chapter 1 that maybe Paul thinks that Romans are either entirely or primarily Gentiles. And I remember in Acts 18 when it talks about Aquila and Priscilla, it says that they had to leave Rome because Claudius made a law that Jews have to leave Rome. So I was just wondering, is it happening about the same time? And also, if Paul is writing Romans before his visit, so we know that he visits in Acts, he visits Rome much later when he's in prison, he's been transferred there. So how much earlier the letter of Romans is written prior to his visit? Just confused about the timeline.
Awesome questions, Masha. Okay, so Masha has a few questions. They're all about what's going on around the time when Paul is writing Romans. And the first question is, what do we know about the church in Rome? And especially, are they Jews? Are they Gentiles? Who are they? That first question is literally what Roman scholars call the, quote, Romans debate. And lots of people think they've settled it, and nobody else agrees with the people who think they've settled it. On the one hand, there is some indication that Paul, who calls himself like the apostle to the Gentiles, right? We've all been reading Romans 1. He emphasizes that he's the apostle to the Gentiles. And throughout his letters, he talks about going to the Gentiles. And in 9 to 11 especially, he's going to explain why he goes to the Gentiles. But it doesn't necessarily follow from that the church in Rome that Paul didn't found would be a Gentile church, because he didn't found it. Maybe some other folks like Peter were going to the Jews. So first, awesome question. Nobody's quite sure. Nobody's quite sure. It's very possible that the church in Rome was sort of a mixed community of some people who were born Jewish, some people who sort of converted or were attracted to Judaism even though they were Gentiles. Maybe they weren't circumcised, but they were sort of like Jewish adjacent. And also then maybe some people who just responded to the gospel straight out of Gentile life. All of those are possible. And I think that's probably the best answer I can reasonably give you, because we're going to see throughout here that whoever Paul is kind of talking back and forth with, they know something about the law. They definitely know some stuff about the law. But whether that's because they were raised Torah observant or because in the course of their lives they were just kind of interested in it is very difficult to say. The other thing about the timeline, I do think, so this is Masha's second question, is about when this letter was written and the scope of Paul's ministry. So this is the basic logic of why Paul's letters are in your New Testament in the order that they're in. They generally go from longest to shortest. Romans is the longest, it comes first. 1 Corinthians is the next longest, it comes second, and so on. But probably, I would say Romans was the last letter Paul wrote in his writing career. Probably. All of that is based on a lot of reconstruction, a lot of historical conjecture. A professor friend of mine says that when you're doing the history of the first generation of Christianity, it's kind of like doing a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle with 27 pieces. And that's true for Romans also. Okay, awesome questions. Any other questions? Yeah, Deb.
This is probably very silly, but if I were to only look at verses 1 to 31, I conclude that he is writing to a church that knows Christ, because it says in verse 8, let me say first of all how your faith is going out throughout the whole world. So I'm a little confused as I read it and think, okay, he's writing to the unchurched, but it's really to the church.
Yeah, so Deb's question is, so the Gentile Jewish question is unsettled. Is Paul writing to a true Christian church or to someone else? I think the answer is he is writing to people who are real Christians, like who have heard some gospel and responded to it. But remember that Christian, at the time when Paul is writing, is still it's still an adjective that's being defined, what exactly it means. Because in a church like Galatia, you can have some folks get real upset when other Christian ministers show up and say, no, you don't just respond to the gospel, you also, the guys, need to be circumcised and submit to the law of Moses. And both of those camps, both Paul and those other folks, would have said they were preaching the real gospel. So Paul knows going into this that the way that he's gone about preaching Christianity, preaching Jesus, proclaiming the gospel, might not be the way that these folks were evangelized. So there is some tension there, Deb. You're not wrong to wonder about the tension. But the way Paul's writing, I think, assumes that they are actually Christian in some form or fashion.
So he's cleaning up. He's kind of shoring up, making things tighter and getting them the truth.
Yeah, I mean, he says this is actually a great segue. I'm just going to launch into 1 to 7 because I think this is where we're going here. There's a few things I would just point out from this first section. These are the verses that we skip a lot, right? Especially when we're getting into a book like Romans. These are the verses that we kind of breeze past to get to the real meaty parts of the letter. But if you do that, you're going to miss that Paul is laying down tracks for some really important themes later in the letter. So, first off, he talks about, in verse 1 and 2, the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. Sometimes you will hear people talk about the gospel as if it was this new thing that has no relationship to the old covenant. Sometimes you'll even hear people make a really strong claim like that the new covenant has completely wiped out the old covenant. That is not Paul's view. Paul's view is that actually, when you read the law and the prophets, they are already preaching the gospel. The Old Testament, from Genesis to Malachi, the message hidden in there is the gospel, but that's why he can call it a mystery, like in Ephesians 6, is because people didn't see it before Christ came. But then Christ came and reveals that the meaning of all of these covenants, all these prophecies, all of these laws, is actually the gospel. So that's point one, because Paul's going to use verses from the Old Testament to explain what he thinks the gospel is and what it means. And we're going to see one when we get to verse 17. All right, another thing to notice. He insists that Jesus, the Son, this is verse 3 now, was descended from David according to the flesh, and also, verse 4, declared to be the Son of God. There's this kind of dual sonship of Jesus, human and divine, but it's not just human in the abstract. It's not just that Jesus is God and human being. It's specifically that Jesus is David's heir, which means that Jesus must be Jewish. That's super important for Paul. That question of ethnicity that Masha's first question was getting at is just massive throughout the whole letter. What's the relationship between Jew and Gentile now? And why does it then matter that Jesus' body is a Jewish body? His physical body is a Jewish body descended from David, descended from Abraham. Just let that question kind of hang out there for a while. Third, what's the point? Why does Paul run around the ancient Mediterranean world preaching the gospel? What does he hope the result is going to be of preaching the gospel? Verse 5, he wants, quote, to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles. Two key words, obedience and faith. Now, throughout all of this Bible study, all of our time together, every now and again, I'm going to quibble with a translation. It's just an occupational hazard, and I'm sorry that all of you are close enough to it that you have to breathe that air too. But I would say, based on my reading of the Greek here, that the phrase faithful obedience probably means obedience which is faithfulness. Like faith equals obedience. So faith is only the sort of thing for Paul that can be manifest in a practical life of obedience to God's commandment. It's like James says, faith without works is dead. Paul's saying basically the same sort of thing here. So what Paul wants to result from preaching the gospel is he wants to see Gentiles respond positively to the gospel, and then he wants to see them actually live lives of obedience to God's commandments, which is huge if one of the big complaints about your ministry is that by not making Gentiles observe Torah, you're just letting them live willy-nilly and sin however they want. Paul says, no, right from the get-go, let's be clear, there's moral stakes in this here. The result of the preaching of the gospel is supposed to be a new form of life of obedience to God. All right. Next, and still, I'm moving a little bit fast here because I want to spend most of our time in the last half of the chapter. this is the bit that Deb's question got to right at the beginning. Like, is Paul writing to Christians? Is he writing to people who are sort of Christians, not yet Christians? What's going on here? I think he's writing to Christians. Point one, because your faith is proclaimed throughout the world. Like, other Christians in other parts of the world who are talking to other Christians in other parts of the world are starting to hear about the church in Rome, sort of in the same way that, like, the disciples in Acts started to hear about Paul after he became a Christian, right? Like, the one who formerly persecuted the church is now preaching that gospel. That's news. It's news that, like, the church in Rome is on the whatever website is maintaining the list of the 50 fastest growing churches in the ancient Mediterranean world. Suddenly, like, there's the Church of Rome. People are like, oh, wow, what's happening there? So Paul knows about the Romans, and he expects that other Christians around the world know about the Romans too. Real Christians. Now, point two, again, this is restating, but you can't restate it too many times. Verse 10, I may somehow at last succeed in coming to you. Paul is writing this because he wants to actually visit these people in person. And this letter is just preparing them for everything that he wants to say and do when he gets there in person. Point three, who is Paul preaching to? And this again gets back to the question of ethnicity that Masha raised at the very, very beginning. Who's Paul obligated to? Greeks and barbarians, to the wise and to the foolish. Who's not on that list? Jews are not on that list. Paul says he's obligated to Greeks and barbarians, to the wise and to the foolish. Now, I grew up in Michigan. Anybody else grow up in Michigan? Yeah. So if you grew up in Michigan, you know that you're either a Yooper or a troll. Because Yoopers live in the Upper Peninsula and trolls live under the bridge. That's like an in-house way that Michiganders would use to, like, classify themselves. Greek or barbarian, that's the same sort of thing. That's the way that especially Greek speakers in the ancient world would refer to people who didn't speak Greek. They would call them barbarians because, like, if you and I were going to just mimic gibberish that someone else was speaking, we might say yada, 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 or blah, 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 or something. Greeks would say bar, bar, bar. That's what non-Greek languages sounded to their ears, like someone was just looking at them saying bar, 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 bar. So they were called barbarians. And Paul's saying, hey, the classification schemes that you use to make sense of each other and to put some folks down and to elevate other folks, I'm obligated to both of you. So you know right from the bat that the gospel's coming to everybody, even the folks that you might have written off as foolish or barbarians.
Did those barbarians include the Jews then, since they were non-Greek?
Probably technically, but especially since at this point Roman Palestine is integrated into the Roman Empire. Not necessarily in this case, because one of the things we'll see later in the letter is we're going to answer the question of why Paul wants to go to Rome to begin with. And spoiler alert, the answer is because he wants to use Rome as a base to get to Spain. And some of the folks in Spain are definitely barbar speakers, right? The farther north and west that you go from Rome, even though, like, at this point the Roman Empire does stretch to, like, Hadrian's Wall in the UK, but the farther from Rome to the north you get, the more you run into these Germanic tribes who, again, spoiler alert, eventually are going to come and sack Rome. But anyway, good question. Any other questions? Because I know I'm moving fast through these verses. I'm just trying to major in the majors to give you some signposts for picking your own way through. Yeah, Paul.
I get the impression that he's I think he's setting the stage, in thinking of what you had said about the perceptions or misperceptions that people had upon his arrival, that he's maybe not only introducing himself as a preacher to the Gentiles, but validating their faith as Gentiles. In other words, that the faith is Jewish, but it's the power of God for everybody, you included. And so I think he's sort of making almost like an inclusiveness statement to them that I'm here for you and I want to strengthen you and I want you to understand what this means.
Yeah, Paul, I think that's a great observation. So for those of you who couldn't hear, Paul's doubling down on that sort of inclusive strain in those verses by pointing out that, for Paul to say that's who he's coming to, he's validating that their faith is not deficient. Because if they were in some churches that Paul knows about, he knows that other sort of traveling apostolic missionary figures might have told them that their faith was deficient. So they can all start breathing a bit of a sigh of relief already, right out of the bat in Romans. Okay, I'm going to forge ahead for the sake of time. And this is where it gets really, really important to slow down. I said last week that these verses here are kind of the thesis statement for the whole of Romans, Romans 1, 16, and 17. He's done with that general introduction. Now he starts to transition you into what he really wants you to know. I'm going to read it. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is God's saving power for everyone who believes, for the Jew first, and also for the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. Every single word that I just read has at least 3 interpretations. I am going to tell you, to the best of my ability, what I think will help you read it. But if you go, especially like some of you in this room who read commentaries for fun, there are really good commentaries that are not going to say exactly what I say. So all of you, it's like the warning label on the package before you open it. That's your warning label. But I am going to tell you what I really think these verses mean, and I encourage you to push back with other questions. All right? It's interesting that Paul starts here, because he hasn't told you what the problem is that he's trying to solve yet by preaching the gospel. We know what the result is. The result is he wants everybody to live a life of faithful obedience. But we don't yet know why that would even be a thing he'd need to work at. What would prevent somebody from living a life of faithful obedience? Just hold on to that question for a second, because Paul starts with the solution, and then he starts to describe the problem. And the solution, he says, is the gospel. The gospel is specifically God's saving power. It's not something that human beings can do for themselves. It's God's saving power. Why would it need to be God's saving power? We don't know yet, right? He hasn't told us. The good Christian answer in the room is because sin. But Paul hasn't said anything about sin yet. He hasn't talked about Adam and Eve or anything else. But we know that whatever else he's going to say, we need God to save us. Or Paul thinks that human beings, Jews and Gentiles alike, need God to save them, because the gospel is for the Jew first and also for the Greek. So even though Paul is describing himself as sort of a apostle who's specially commissioned to go to Gentiles, he does think that the gospel is for Jews too, not just Gentiles. When you get into a church the size of ours, you generally have pastors who have sort of specialized ministry areas. You sort of divide it up so everybody can cover everything. It's the reason why Pastor Mike is the executive pastor and I am not. But it's a really good thing that I am not. Paul is saying that he and the other apostles are kind of like that too. His special commission is to go to not Jews, even though Paul is a super educated, super committed Jew. At no point does Paul stop being a Jew. But he knows that his specific call is to go to the Greeks, the Gentiles, the barbarians. And in here, he's just using Greek as sort of the stand-in for people who aren't Jews. And what happens in the gospel? It reveals the righteousness of God. Notice how the emphasis so far is on God. The gospel is God's saving power. The gospel is revealing God's righteousness. And one of the ways it's going to do that, and this is really, really important to Paul, I'm just going to hint here, because Masha's question should still just be echoing around the room. one of the ways that we see God's own righteousness is in his faithfulness to Israel. Like, this is a question I'll probably raise a couple times over their meeting time together. But imagine for a minute that you were a Gentile and you were in Rome. And maybe you knew something about Judaism in the past, because there are Jews around you. And maybe you're kind of like attracted to the way that they live, and you're like, wow, their law is actually kind of profound. And then you hear that there's these people coming from other Jews, like Jews' mother country in Jerusalem, and who are starting to talk about this Jesus guy who they claim to be the Messiah to Jews. And you're seeing all these Gentiles responding to the gospel, but not so many Jews. Here's a question. Is God still being faithful to Israel then? If God sends the Jewish Messiah to the Jews and they don't respond, and to some degree the gospel is God's own saving power, is he not using that saving power to save Israel? And then here's the next logical question. If, hypothetically, maybe God isn't being faithful to Israel, if I say yes to the Messiah, will he be faithful to me? Is God actually faithful and righteous at the end of the day? And Paul says, yes. Actually, the gospel is going to reveal the nature of God's own righteousness. So he's setting down these themes that are going to come up, the problems that he's going to address, the questions that he's going to answer later in the letter. He just wants to get them in our ears right from the very beginning. This is why I think it matters that he starts with David in those first verses. That it matters that Jesus is David's heir, and that it's going to matter later that Jesus is Abraham's offspring, that Jesus is an Israelite. Because Jesus' own righteousness as an Israelite is going to be one of the places where you see God's faithfulness and his power manifest. All right. Now here's the last key term that I want to talk about from these couple verses. Faith. Verse 16, the gospel is God's saving power for everyone who believes. Now, what's not obvious to you in English, but that's obvious in Greek, is that the verb believe and the noun faith are two forms of the same word. So I'd say every time in Romans where you see the verb to believe, you could translate it as has faith or is faithful. And every time you see the noun faith, you could talk about it as belief or faithfulness. Those two things, they go together. They should echo in your mind. So the gospel is God's saving power for everyone who has faith, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith, for faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. That verse is one of the bangers of the Old Testament that's on the greatest hits album in the New Testament. This verse pops up in Galatians, this verse pops up in Hebrews, and because it's in Habakkuk, you've probably never heard a sermon on it from Habakkuk. But if you go, it's a short little read. Habakkuk's only 3-4 chapters. This is from Habakkuk chapter 2, where the prophet says, and this is Paul's quotation, the one who is righteous will live by faith. But here's the trick. Paul, like most other Christians in the first century, when he is reading and quoting from the Old Testament, what we today would call the Old Testament, Israel's scriptures, he's quoting from Greek translations of Hebrew originals. It's called, in shorthand, we just call that the Septuagint. Anyone ever heard anybody reference the Septuagint? Yeah, I mean the story that makes its way into the ancient world is that at one point in Egypt, when there's all these Jews running around, the folks who succeeded, like the pharaohs as Alexander the Great's rulers in Egypt, the Ptolemies you'd call them, ordered a bunch of Jews to produce a Greek translation of their scriptures so that the Greek speakers could understand it. And the way the story goes is that they locked 70 of them into different rooms to produce their own translations, and then when the 70 interpreters came back out and compared notes, it turned out they'd all used exactly the same words, so that therefore you could be confident that the Septuagint was inspired, because how else do you explain 70 dudes locked in 70 rooms translating all of these texts in the exact same way? Now, by the way, we can look at the manuscript evidence and know that that's not true. That definitely didn't happen. But it was a story that folks used to give you some confidence in the use of Jewish scriptures translated into Greek. But this is why this matters. It's because when you go, let's see, maybe we should do a sword drill. Who can find Habakkuk 2 the fastest? Monty's got it. Oh, Monty. Okay, Monty, what is it? Can you read Habakkuk 2:4 in your translation, which is the NIV, NAS, ESV? Let's hear it from the ESV.
Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by his faith.
But the righteous shall live by his faith. Okay, so here's the question. Who is his? Is it the righteous person's faith, or is it referring to somebody else's faith, like maybe God's? Now, when you read the Septuagint, the manuscripts that kind of come together in the tradition that we call the Septuagint, and this is the way that it's quoted in Hebrews 10, Hebrews 10:38 says, the one who is righteous will live by my faith. Or maybe my faith. It depends on, see, I've got these 3 Greek letters here in yellow. This could say, my righteous one, or it could say, my faith. The one who is righteous will live by my faith is a very standard way to understand this text. Whenever you run across Paul quoting like a snippet from the Old Testament, if you can figure out where the snippet is from, it's always worth your time to go back and just kind of like read the context and figure out what he might be alluding to that he doesn't say. Because he's writing for people who know something about these texts. So it's sort of like if I just started to hum, dun, da da dun, da da dun, 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 or I mean, I was trying to go for Star Wars there and butchered it. But if you heard the first 4 notes, like the opening notes of Star Wars, you would know immediately like what the whole song sounds like. It's like that with Habakkuk too. So when Paul doesn't include the word my, you're not wrong to like go back to the Septuagint and look at the way that the Septuagint translates this text and to think that people might have got there on their own. So, everybody confused yet? Yeah, like this is a fair amount of detail, but we have to go slow and get this detail because Paul is giving you the thesis statement for the whole letter. So we'll hang out here a bit. Like Kara, yeah, go for it.
Sorry, just to clarify, is Paul quoting from the Septuagint or is he kind of retranslating the Hebrew into...
Yeah, if you answer that, you win the golden cigar. No, generally, when we look at Paul's quotations of Hebrew Scripture, it occurs, a little more than 100 times in Paul's surviving letters, and you compare his wording to surviving manuscripts of the Septuagint, it looks most of the time like Paul is quoting from Greek manuscripts of the Old Testament, that his primary Bible, at least when he quotes it for his audience, was Greek. But there are some times when it doesn't line up exactly, and then there's 2 possibilities. One, maybe Paul was reading a Greek version of the Old Testament that we just don't have preserved because it's really old. Or 2, maybe Paul was intentionally correcting it toward the Hebrew. That's a really technical argument for New Testament scholars, but it's exactly the right question. Yeah?
Can I ask a follow-up question then? Do we know how, like when the Gospels quote Jesus quoting the Old Testament, or when other writers of the epistles quote the Old Testament, is it a similar thing to how Paul's doing it? Like, is it
Yeah.
kind of clear?
Yeah, so I mean the question is like what's going on with all of these other early Christians when they quote the Old Testament? Generally speaking, it looks like the Septuagint. It's usually recognizably Septuagintal, but we're doing a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle with 27 pieces. So it takes a lot of specialized historical work to really dig in there. Yeah?
I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent here, but how do you interpret with your background in God, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith? That's translated differently
Yep.
in different translations.
Sure is. Yep. I think it's an awesome question. And again, there's 3, 4, 5, 6 ways. And,
Tell you what you think.
and unfortunately, the answer has nothing to do with my knowing Greek or not. Like, because at the end of the day, at this point, all of you can probably guess what the Greek word faith there is. Like, it's pistis. If you've been around church and you've heard anybody reference pistis, that's what it is. This is the trick with interpreting this bit in Romans, and I swear I will answer your question about like by faith, for faith. This is why I'm hanging out here in detail, because when you're reading Romans, you have to interpret the confusing little parts in light of how you understand the whole. Like, the better you understand the whole argument of Romans, the easier you're going to find it to make good sense of a couple confusing words here and there. But the opposite's also true. The better you interpret the little confusing words, the clearer your perception of the whole is going to be. And so you're always going to be wobbling back and forth between, like, what does the whole thing say so that I can understand this little question, and what does this nitpicky little question mean so that I can better understand the whole? Okay, that said, what I think by faith, for faith means could mean two things. One option would be to say that that's a reference to the two covenants. Because Paul's about to argue, like in Romans 4, that Abraham's faith is really the meaning of the old covenant, the first covenant. So, at the end of the day, we're not talking about law versus faith. We're talking about from one faith to like an expression of the same faith in a new covenant. That's a possibility. Another possibility would be to say we're talking about two faithful actors' faith, two faithful people's or individuals' faith. So I am inclined personally to take this as saying, if I were going to expand on Paul's like really condensed wording, I might say, in it the righteousness of God through his faithfulness for our faithfulness. That might be how I would translate it. But look, those three words are super debated. And you're just getting my take right now on it. No, but here's why I say that I think it's from God's faithfulness for our faithfulness. When we look at faith so far, like we spent this time in Habakkuk, and me explaining why I think that Habakkuk probably says, the one who is righteous will live by my faithfulness. That's probably what it means here. So whose faith is it that saves in the gospel? Because back in verse 16, Paul said, the gospel is God's saving power for everyone who believes. So the people who are being saved are people who are believing. But the faith that Habakkuk says is the saving faith, the faith that's connected with righteousness, is God's faithfulness. The one who is righteous will live by my faithfulness, not their faithfulness. So whose faith are we talking about here? God's faithfulness or human faithfulness? How do you circle that square? Like that's the question. I'm going to answer it. I think we're talking about both. It's both at the same time. If you've listened to me preach over the last couple of years, there's one theme that you know I come back to and work in whenever I can. And it's what people could call, quote, participation. Participation is an ancient philosophical term. Don't get hung up on that. But participation is one of the most important theological concepts from the New Testament and from the church up through the medieval period, that actually through the Reformation, that we kind of forget about in the 17th century and have started to rediscover in the mid-19th century. And what participation means is this. Participation is how one thing takes on the characteristics, the qualities, the powers, the virtues of another thing. And this is true for like gods and people, not just for things and things. But let's start with things and things. Because this is, if you're an ancient philosopher like Aristotle, one of the things you're interested in is what we today would call physics. And one of the questions in physics is what happens if you blend two things together? Does it become a third thing? Do they both remain individual things that are now like combined and retaining their own individual? Like those are the kind of questions that nerds broke their heads on from the 4th century BC onward. And when they were answering that question about physics, one of the concepts they came up with was participation. You probably know, whether you know it or not, some of the Greek words that they use to describe participation, like koinonia. Fellowship, it's often translated. So think about it this way. If I had like a chunk of metal, and I were a blacksmith, and I were heating that metal up in a fire so that I could work with it, eventually it's not just the fire that's glowing red and hot, it's the metal too. So the metal, which is not by nature shiny and hot, has now taken on some of the characteristics of the fire, which is, by nature, shiny and hot. And that's participation. The metal has taken on the properties of fire. Now, that's thing to thing. Now, how about human and God? This is where participation starts to become really important for the ways that early Christians like Paul think about the human relationship with God. Their argument, basically, is that you and I and other Christians are kind of like that lump of metal that got thrown into a fire. So that by proximity to God, we start to take on the qualities and characteristics of God. We start to do, by participation, what God does by nature. And that's how faith in Romans 1:16 and 17 can be both God's nature and a thing that we can do. God is by nature faithful. He keeps every promise to Abraham, to David, to Israel. In Jesus, God keeps every promise. And Jesus' faithfulness to God's righteous decree demonstrates that a human being can do it, can obey it, the stuff that God says to do. So, for those of us who wonder how belief happens, this is it. It's God making us, as 2 Peter says, participants in the divine nature. So that the faith that God is, we can start to live out of the actual power of God. Our belief is the power of God in us that we are acting with and on. All right. That is abstract, that is conceptual, but I hope that little metaphor of the lump of metal in a fire can give you something to hang your hat on. Now just in your mind, pretend that that lump of metal is you and that fire is God. So this is what I would want to say then. This is what salvation is, but Paul is saying. Salvation consists basically in becoming righteous by sharing in the power of God. In this case, God's own faithfulness. There is none righteous, no, not one. I know one who's righteous, though, God. So how do we become righteous? Sharing in God's righteousness, His faithfulness. And that, I think, is what Romans 1:16 and 17 is about. It's about a message of salvation where you have to believe, where you have to become righteous, but you can trust that you can live from God's own faithfulness. His native faithfulness becomes yours by gift, by grace. And that's for Jews, and that's for Greeks. But it's also, note, the message of the Old Testament prophets. Like Paul's saying, this is what Habakkuk was talking about all those centuries ago. Habakkuk was talking about a new covenant salvation where we would share in the faithfulness of God so that we could live like God does. Okay. I want to pause here because I cannot overstate how important these verses are to understanding the whole. If you are understanding that much so far, you are a long ways towards understanding Romans. If you do not understand that yet, do not feel bad. That's not simple, right? I don't know when the last time was that you took an ancient philosophy class, but that's not simple. But Paul is using language from his ancient philosophical context to try and explain as best as he's able the spiritual dynamics of Christian life. So, questions? Yeah, Doug.
Almost all the translations imply by the wording that it's the individual story.
In like,
The just shall live by faith.
yes.
Stuff like that. They all imply small words. You're saying it's a capital H.
I'm saying it's both at the same time, which is even worse, probably. Yeah. Yeah, right, because here's the thing. If you look at the Hebrew, if you look at the Hebrew of Habakkuk 2, it looks more like it's lowercase h. if you look at the Greek translations of Habakkuk 2 that Paul was quoting from, and that the author of Hebrews quotes, it looks more like it's probably capital. So, yes. Now, I would say that the English translations don't rule out the reading that I've just given you. Yeah. I'm actually not even, well, I mean, it depends on the translation, right? Because there's translations and there are translations. So, the question is, do the English translations of this verse actually, jibe with the reading that I just gave? And without going and comparing all of them, I would say probably that the most of them that I have looked at least leave open the possibility of the reading that I've given. And it's just our context in evangelical churches in the West that makes us assume that it means one thing and not the other.
Some of them just by faith. They don't even try to answer the question.
Right.
It's just the fact of faith
Right.
on somebody's part.
Yeah, so Doug's pointing out that a lot of times translations don't even try to get too particular here. And I actually think that's really wise, Doug, that translations don't try to get too particular with this, because it leaves room for faithful preaching to try and discern the biblical mystery of the gospel. If you tried to cram every single necessary word that you think is necessary based on your interpretation into the translation, suddenly the book is going to grow by 50%. So you have to leave room for people to get into the weeds with commentaries and write articles and papers and go to conferences and other pastors to hash it out. What does this actually mean? Because it's like the work of the church for thousands of years to try and fathom this mystery. Yeah.
If I'm understanding you correctly, this sounds very similar. You preached a sermon a couple, 2-3 months ago on John chapter 6.
Yes.
Where basically you had that slide up of a paradox.
Yep.
You talked about where Jesus said twice, nobody can come to the Father, nobody can come to me unless the Father draws him, but at the same time it's our choice. This sounds very similar.
I think you're right. I thought the same thing when I was preparing this talk. So some of you were probably here to hear that sermon. Some of you may not have been. The key verse here in John 6 is where some folks ask Jesus, what must we do to work the works of God? And they think they're asking, the work that God requires people to work. And Jesus' answer is, the work of God is this, to believe in the one whom he has sent. But when Jesus is replying, he means two things at once. On the one hand, it is the work of God that they think they're asking about, the work that God requires people to do. God requires people to believe in the one whom he has sent. But it's also the work of God, God giving us the faith and empowering us with the faith that we need to do the believing. And it's both at the same time. And I think, yes, Paul's view of faith is the same, or at least highly compatible, using different words but getting at that same reality. That faith is God's own virtue, but he gives it to us and lets us work with it. And then we have to engage it. It's up to us to engage it, but we still need him to do the giving to begin with.
Faith comes by hearing.
And hearing by the word of God. There you are. That's right. Yeah, Diane.
Verse 18, we talked a lot about righteousness and unrighteousness. In verse 18, there's differentiation between unrighteousness and ungodliness. Do you have a simple definition to differentiate those two terms?
Actually, I think you should treat them as synonyms. They mean the same thing. It's two words for the same thing. Because if Habakkuk 2:4, the one who is righteous will live by my faithfulness, God is also the righteous one. So unrighteousness is also ungodliness.
Oh.
So I would take it as two words meaning the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, Masha.
So you said that in Greek words, faith and believe are both derived linguistically from the same root.
Yes.
So what about word righteousness? Not righteousness, faithfulness.
It's the same word. Pistis. Okay, so Masha's question, if to believe and faith in Greek derive from the same word, the English transliteration would be P-I-S-T, that's the stem, pist, then what about faithfulness? The word that we translate faith also means faithfulness. It's the same word.
So is it possible that the verse in Habakkuk could mean the righteous will live by my faithfulness, not by my faith?
Yes. So Masha's question, is it possible that the verse from Habakkuk 2:4 could mean that the one who is righteous will live by my faithfulness? Also could, trying to phrase it, but yes, that word faith or faithfulness is exactly the same in Habakkuk 2:4. You would be justified in reading it both ways, in ways that mean primarily one or the other, or in ways that mean both at the same time. Yes, good question, Masha. Look, I'm happy to hang out here, but yeah, Stephen, you just put your hand up. Go for it.
Just a real quick detour. It has nothing to do with any of that.
Let's make sure that there are no other questions on this highway, and then we'll take the detour. Are there other questions on this one? Because look, if you don't totally feel like you understand this right now, the idea is central enough to the letter that like faith is sharing in the faithfulness of God, so that when we believe, we're engaging the power of God, and that's what salvation comes from. Like, we're going to come back to that a few times, so if you're a little like stumped by that right now, you don't have to like panic. We're going to come back. This is the first time it's in your ear. But any other questions on this? Yeah, Monty.
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, I think for me and probably for others of us, like, we've heard these verses preached like 1,000 times, and I mean, the way I always heard it when I was younger was this distinction between faith and works, right?
Yep.
You know, the Lutheran distinction. If I'm hearing you right, are you saying that maybe that is I don't want to say the wrong way, but we're reading something into the verse that's not there, or there's a distinction that we placed on there that was in response to Catholic abuses that maybe wasn't there?
Monty, I'm really glad you asked the question. Okay, so for everybody in the room, hear this. So Monty's like, look, we've all heard this verse preached a bunch, and usually when people talk about faith in Paul, it's juxtaposed with works, so that we're saved by faith and not by works, right? This is a really, really an important and not terribly complicated, but super important theological discussion from the last 500 years. And I'm not going to give you all 500 years right now, but I would say this. How do I want to explain this in 3 minutes or less? We think we know what Luther meant when he said saved by faith and not by works. In the last 40 years, there's a branch of Luther scholarship, like people who just read Martin Luther in German all day. And it's called the New School on Lutheran Interpretation. You could look at a Finnish guy named Tuomo Mannermaa, who wrote a book on Luther and faith called Christ Present in Faith, where he shows that actually when Luther talks about faith, he means it in the participatory sense that I'm talking about. When you go back to the first generation reformers, to Luther and to Calvin, they are talking about faith as participation in God. What happens is that in the century after the death of the first generation reformers, when people start to codify and simplify and clarify the thought of the early reformers like Luther and Calvin, they forget participation and they focus on justification. So really, we're not arguing with Luther and Calvin, we're arguing with the people who simplified and codified Luther and Calvin, called Protestant scholasticism, in the century after they died. So that's point one. Point two, though, justified by faith and not by works, because Paul is clear that you are saved by faith and not by works. What does Paul mean when he says works? If you are part of that post-Reformation Protestant scholasticism school, you think works means anything that I could do would not save me. Paul does not, I think, mean that. Paul is talking not about works, he is specifically talking about debate over whether you need to obey the Torah or not. So works in Paul, a lot of times it doesn't just say works, it says works of law. That's the question. If you are a Gentile man and you respond to the gospel and you are baptized, do you then need to be circumcised and obey all of the Torah? And Paul's answer is no, because that's what he means by works. He's talking about the distinction between two covenants. And he's saying, you Gentiles, you're saved under like the strictures of the new covenant, not of the old covenant. So the works of law from the old covenant don't pertain to you. And those are the two things I would say to clarify. Like one, Actually, Calvin and Luther are here with me, if I'm reading them rightly. And I think the best recent scholarship on Calvin and Luther is. And 2, when Paul says works, usually he doesn't just mean works in the abstract, he means specifically Torah. Awesome question. Yeah?
I'm trying to simplify all this in my brain. Can I say that, I'm trying to say back to you what I heard you say, our faith is God's faith.
Our faith is God's faith. Is that a fair summary of what I said? I say yes. But it's still a thing that we do. It's a thing that we engage. It's kind of like, think about Jesus' parable of the talents. Like, the guy gives talents to his servants for them to do business with while he's away. I mean, the talents are his. We have to do business with them. The faith is God's own faith. We have to do business with it. We have to engage it. Yes. Great summary. Yeah, Fran.
So if God is the impetus of our faith, isn't that essentially predestination?
Fran's question is, if God is like the impetus or the source of our faith, isn't that in some sense like predestination? I would say that that is compatible with a view of salvation as predestination, but it's not necessary. Look, I do have views on this, as my wife will tell you. But whatever your view of salvation, if you think that predestination in sort of like the strongest Calvinist sense of the word is the way the gospel works, then you would say, yes, God, of course, God has to give faith in order for people to believe. So if God gives faith to people, therefore, they believe. On the other hand, you could also be the strongest Arminian in the room, like John Wesley, and say, yes, God's faith does have to come first, but then it's up to us to engage it or not. So for Wesley, the answer is, yes, God's grace and the gift of faith comes first. But then whether you're saved or damned depends on what you do with it. And for Calvin, and like Reformed heirs of Calvin, he would say, if God has like actually given you divine faith, well then of course you're going to use it. It's the nature of the thing to be used in that way. So what I'm saying about participation and faith as God's own faith, our faith is God's faith, you could develop that in either like a Wesleyan Arminian direction or in a Calvinist predestinarian direction. It's compatible with both.
It just seems to me that the works that I do are not the works that I used to do. And therefore, the works that I do really are because of what God has done in me and is doing in me. I mean, and it's continuing, it's a growth, and it's by His direction, not mine. I'm not that smart.
Yeah. Me either. So like Fran is saying that at this point in his Christian life, he feels like the good things that he does aren't really even his anyway, that it's God doing them in him and through him, because he's aware of his own limitations. And this is why I think on the last day, all glory will go to him. Like at the end of the day, every knee will bow and we will this is why in the end, God receives all glory. On the other hand, God promises reward for his people. Like there is actually a reward stored up for the righteous who have labored faithfully for him. And both of those things are true. And that's part of this is one reason why, remember that old Yancey book, What's So Amazing About Grace? This is one of the things that I think is amazing about grace, is that at the end of the day, none of this would be possible if it weren't for God graciously giving us his own nature. And yet at the same time, in the end, when we've made use of what he's given us, he still rewards us almost as if it was up to us to begin with. That's the incredible generosity of God. But anyway, I'm going to get off track if I preach that sermon. Yeah, Paul, you've had your hand up.
Real quick, C.S. Lewis said faith and obedience were like two sides of the same coin. I think our tendency as linear thinkers, particularly if you've come out of any sort of reform or whatever view of salvation is not by works by faith, is that we tend to see it as a two-dimensional object. It's like this is an idea, I've gotten faith, and then there's works, which is some other thing, and it isn't. It's a three-dimensional organic thing.
Yes.
It's like what you've inherited from God is like inheriting a dog. Okay, it's a living thing, but it's not outside of you; it's inside of you, and so you're responding to it. gets out of the ideas and more into something entirely different. Getting to your rewards the same way.
Yeah.
If I live a good life, I get the healthy life. I get the reward of being healthy.
Mhm.
Is you know what I mean? It's like
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, yeah, the rewards, and you could either look at them as complete rain from God, which it is, but it's also just you lived in faith, and the response of living in faith is good stuff.
Yeah. I can't say that better. I hope everybody was listening. For the sake of time, I've got to do like the last half of the chapter. Look, it's not a bad thing that we spent as much time as we did in 1:16 and 17. Because if you get even if you don't feel like you totally understand, if you have all those big ideas in your head, you've got some really, really useful signposts to help guide you through the next few chapters of Romans. Okay, now ask yourself why you think people do bad things. Because remember, everything that Paul just said in 1:16 and 17, he's presented as the solution for the problem. He hasn't told you what the problem is yet. And he told you in the verses before that he wants, like Paul's talking about, faith and obedience, faithful obedience, the faith that is obedience, the obedience that is faithfulness, to be the result of preaching the gospel. So why do people do bad stuff? Why do they do the other thing? Like the not righteous thing, the not faithful thing? I mean, in Paul's day and in ours, lots of explanations. If you're Socrates, you think at the end of the day, all sin is ignorance. If people just knew the right thing, they would do the right thing. If you're Aristotle and you're coming after Socrates, you'd be like, true, but not enough. People also have to want the right thing. There's plenty of people who know what the right thing is. They just want the other thing, so they do what they want instead of what they know. You can think about social pressure. We're all kind of habituated into, just by the way we live our lives and the people we live them around, into doing the wrong thing. Jean-Jacques Rousseau said that. Or, if you want to get all Freudian on it, you have these unconscious impulses. Somebody was talking about a movie that's like C.S. Lewis and Freud in dialogue. Apparently that's a thing right now. There's a lot that I could add there, but those are just some of the big explanations. Paul's answer is at least as philosophically big picture and as profound as any of those explanations. And in fact, throughout this letter, because the first two in particular are big answers in his own world, he's going to tackle both of those, the question of ignorance and the question of desire. So watch out for those. So what's the problem? What do we need to be saved from? If we're being saved for faithful obedience, what are we being saved from? Answer in 1:18, the wrath of God. The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and injustice of those who by their injustice, by the way, injustice is the same word as unrighteousness, suppress the truth. So, every sin has a consequence. And God, as the ultimate source of justice and righteousness in the universe, imposes consequences on sin. Now, what do those consequences look like? I'm going to probably go back and forth here a little bit between these slides for the sake of time, but when God is expressing his judgment on sin, the consequences for sin, there's a verb that comes up 3 times between now and the end of the chapter. Giving over. God gave them over. God gave them over. God gave them over. In the first place, 1:24, he gives them over to lusts, like the desires of their heart. Now, a lot of times in church, when we use the word lust, we just mean one thing. We just mean sexual desire that's out of order, right? Paul, in 1:24, it's plural. Desires, lusts is plural. He's talking about all kinds of desires that have gone awry. A next thing that Paul says God gives people over to is passions. Now, passions is not a word that you've probably heard from the pulpit recently. But it's a really, really important concept in ancient philosophy. And the passions are something like our natural emotional capacities, which in moderation and in proportion are good, that get blown up to such extremes that we end up being ruled by them. In ancient world philosophy, your soul has 3 parts. And just for the sake of time right now, I'll talk about 2. One's the part that wants, and one is the part that knows. Passions are what happen when the parts of your soul that want things get too big and powerful and overwhelm the part that knows. So Paul says one of the consequences for sin is giving people over to passions. so that these emotions, these desires just get blown out of control and overwhelm people's minds. But by the way, here's another thing he gives people over to. In 128, God gave them over to an unfit mind. The word unfit is tricky. It's the only time in the New Testament that this word appears. I'd probably translate it as unreliable. And basically he's saying people's minds can no longer accurately determine what's good from what's bad. That's what it means to have an unreliable mind, is to be presented with a panel of options where you have to choose one, and you need to choose the good one, but you don't have the capacity anymore. It'd be like asking my daughter to choose my retirement plan. She's 5. Right? Like, there's nothing wrong with my daughter. It's just her mental capacity is not up to that. So, this is what Paul says we need to be saved from. And the giving over verb is also really, really interesting, because think about, where in the Old Testament does God give over? Like, think about the book of Judges. What happens when Israel sins in Judges? Like, God withdraws his presence and gives them over into the power of their enemies. It's not like God is directly afflicting them. It's not like God is himself making war upon them. He's just letting them see what it's like to try and do this on their own without him. That's what the wrath of God looks like that Paul says we need to be saved from, is being given over to ourselves, because our minds aren't smart enough. Our passions get out of control. Our lusts will lead us to the wrong thing. Yeah, I'm sorry, just for the sake of time, I got to forge ahead, so hold your question.
No, just real, okay, go ahead. No,
Yeah. Now, if that's the wrath, that's one thing we need to be saved from. What is it actually that people have done wrong that produces the wrath? God withdrawing, God giving over. End of verse 18. Suppress the truth. Verse 22. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. For Paul, what he's basically doing is he's diagnosing sin in the culture around him. And if you're a Jew looking at sin in Gentile culture around you, one of the things you can't miss is like what Paul sees in Acts 17. Your cities are full of idols. You don't have to know more of the Torah than the 10 Commandments to know that that's out of bounds, like graven images, other gods. So how did Gentile culture, like the people that Paul is called to evangelize, how did they get there? He says this is a suppression of the truth, which means, and I'm going to read some of the non-highlighted stuff here. Verse 19, what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power, divine nature, invisible though they are, have been seen and understood through the things God has made, so that they are without excuse. He's saying that at the end of the day, wherever idolatry originated, there was enough evidence in creation around them that should have convinced people that idolatry was a stupid idea. But they did it anyway. And the result of that kind of suppression of the truth was God giving them over into things that even Greeks and Romans didn't like. Unreliable minds, controlled by passions and lusts. So Paul is presenting the gospel to a Greek and Roman as the answer to the thing that they want to find. This is the big question in moral philosophy in Paul's day. It would be it's like going to a university or a political convention and asking people, what actually is human flourishing? Or when the framers of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, are talking about happiness, what do they mean and what do we have to get there? And lots of philosophers at the university, lots of politicians could give you answers. It's that kind of question that Paul is addressing in the first century. What do you need to do to be ruled by your reason and not overcome by your passions? And Paul's saying at the end of the day, you need to be saved from the wrath of God through the hearing of the gospel. That's the only way. Okay, we got time. Real fast. Question. Sorry.
First one, the New American Standard, back in that.
This one?
Yeah, I know that's.
It is not.
Pardon me?
That's the NRSV, I think.
All right. New American Standard, which was supposed to be a translation, says a depraved mind. And to to me, that's a little different than unreliable.
I agree. And that's why I say it's a tough word. It's the only time the word occurs in the New Testament. And it's not a very common word outside the New Testament either. So like to answer the question of what the Greek word adokimos means, you have to do a lot of work. And in my case, it just meant going through a thesaurus of all the time that word occurred over like a 1,000-year span. And that's what I did for 3 days. And so I'm giving you my best answer. That's my best answer. But yes, fair question. Okay. So the result of being given over to a depraved or an unfit or an unreliable mind is doing the wrong things now. So like you start by doing the wrong thing, then the wrath of God has him give you over to all these nasty things, and the result is you just do more of it. So it's like a negative feedback loop. And Paul's saying this is what the culture around him is caught in, is this negative feedback loop of not really knowing God, and so doing the wrong thing, and therefore like perpetuating ignorance of God and doing more wrong things, so that by the time you get down to verse 32, they not only practice these things, but they applaud others who practice them. Like they're so lost that like they don't know their moral up from their moral down. Okay, so this is it. Like what's the problem? If the gospel solution is doing faithful things by God's own powerful faithfulness in you, the problem is not doing good things because they can't even figure out what the good thing is. It's that their mind doesn't know what's good, and so their bodies don't do what's good, and because their bodies don't do what's good, their mind can't figure out what's good. And the problem is balancing that mental and active, I mean, like, what do you want to call it? Like system. It's just getting all of that equation balanced. They know, we have to know the truth about God's decree. That verb, that noun in 132, decree, God's decree is really important. It'll come up a couple times in the letter. The Greek word is dikaioma. The word for righteousness or righteous person is dikaios. So Paul's talking about God's righteous decree here. What does God say you need to do in order to be righteous? That's God's decree, his dikaioma. The Gentiles around him don't know what God decrees to be righteous, and they don't do it. Now, we have all of 4 minutes here, but let me just point this out. It's kind of interesting that when Paul goes about talking about what's wrong in the world around him, he doesn't start with like the invasion of sin in Genesis. Like if you were like, I don't know, pigeonholed on the street by somebody who knew you were a Christian and they asked you to explain like what Christians think about sin and what's wrong with the world, lots of us would go to Adam and Eve. Paul doesn't. Paul starts with a really, really common Jewish critique of culture around him, which is to look at the big things that they see wrong in the culture around them, and then he works backward from there to explain where it came from. So for Paul, he's talking about idolatry, and I didn't highlight it before now, but he's talking about same-sex sexual interactions. He's saying those are examples of places where people's minds don't discern the truth and their bodies don't act according to the truth. Now, that's important because if you've heard this verse taught on, this passage, this half of Romans 1 taught on in the last 10 or 15 years when human sexuality has been a big hot-button topic for the church, you could come away with the impression that the point to Romans 1 is making it clear that Christians can't engage in same-sex sexual activity. I think that Paul is clear that he thinks that's a bad feature of Gentile culture around him. But that's not the point. Paul didn't write these verses to like bash gay people. He's giving you one example of what happens when minds and desire get out of alignment with the will of God. So, for any of you who like feel sexually attracted to people of the same sex, one thing you can know is this. For Paul, this is a normal enough feature of human life that it's not especially like weird or gross or scary. It's just one example of something that Paul says doesn't line up with God's righteous decree. And for those of you who might be tempted to focus on the gay verses in Romans 1, because it aligns with our sort of view of Christians in relation to culture, note that as far as Paul's concerned, the real problem here is, do you know what God's decree is, and do you obey it? That's at the end of the day the rock bottom question. Right. And that's the wrath of God, right. So, I know we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but it's not, if you've attended a church like ours for any length of time, you know what evangelicals, Christians, will teach about same-sex sexual activity. That's not the primary point to this passage, even if that teaching is a faithful reading of this text. So don't get hung up on the faithful reading of this text and miss the primary point that Paul's making. That we need to be saved from the wrath of God that's left us subject to these blown out of proportion desires. We need to be saved from the wrath of God that's left us with our own weak minds that can't find the truth for ourselves. And that the gospel, the preaching of the gospel, is the way that God imparts His own power and faithfulness to us so that we can live faithfully and fulfill that righteous decree of God's. Okay, we're just about out of time, but the last thing I want to say, again, just because this is a passage that folks have used to really, really drill down and try and figure out what's going on with human sexuality here. Paul doesn't say anything about what we today would call sexual orientation. He's just talking about desire. He's working with his own framework for what goes right and what goes wrong in human behavior. So sexual orientation is a modern concept that emerges much later when people are trying to figure out why some people are attracted to other people and not to other people. And I mention that because this is, again, one of those passages that folks in our tradition have used like a cudgel to smash people over the head with, to make them feel like they are bad, people intrinsically because of their, quote, sexual attraction. Or their sexual orientation. And orientation is it's not an idea from this text. Even if I would say this text rules out certain forms of sexual behavior, it doesn't raise the issue of orientation and being gay or being straight or being, in my case, a cisgendered heterosexual white male. That's modern language that we'd use. It's not Paul's.